Hey everybody, Cold on here with another VOX Immortalis commentary guide. This video is for Heroic Lord Rhyolith in Firelands, and this is 10-man. So before I get into the strategy, I just need to say a few things, get on my soapbox about the frustration that is this encounter. This is by far one of the most discouraging fights that we've seen in Cataclysm so far. And the reason for this is because the control over Rhyolith's movement is extremely finicky. It feels like there's a huge disconnect between the three major components of controlling his movement in this fight. Those being DPS to the legs, which turn him, and then from that DPS, that reflection in the UI element that actually indicates which way he's turning, and then the next final step from that element to the actual game screen, meaning, what you see as far as Rhyolith's current direction or facing. And it feels like there are disconnects between those steps at some point, such that the raid itself has very little control over his movement and precision of that movement. And this issue is only exacerbated by the fact that you only have basically 6, maybe 7 DPS on a 10-man raid for this, such that when one player swaps from one leg to the other to do a turn or, straighten him out, that's a huge percentage of potential burst DPS that would otherwise turn him one way or the other. So you get these big spikes in turning, or you expect things to go straight and suddenly he'll just flip one direction, or, the issue is like he'll stomp, and during that he'll sort of remember turning damage that you've done to him at times, and it's all very inexplicable, to the point where it almost became necessary to create an entire add-on just to try to estimate how the turning worked based on damage or number of hits. Did dots affect it? Is it debuffs? Is it in a certain time frame, the last 5 seconds or 1 second, or all this stuff? And we didn't have to resort to that, but this fight still took us 86 attempts, and the vast majority of those, probably 75 or 80% of those, were basically doing sound strategies that we knew we were doing things properly, but in the end, we just didn't have enough control over what was happening. It just felt like it was out of our hands. And I'm all for random elements in fights, if that makes things interesting. It's not any fun to know whether you're going to win or lose every time. But in this case, it felt so beyond our control, and more importantly, we didn't have information. There wasn't any feedback loop really telling us this is what you're doing wrong, this is what you're doing right, and this is how you resolve it. And it's made worse by the fact that this is the Firelands raid, and the dungeon journals come out, so you're sort of expected now to have everything laid out for you. Blizzard wants people to know what's happening in the encounter. But in reality, all you get is this UI element that you can't monitor, you can't look up in logs, you have no way to tell other than seeing it in the game. And it just is a lot of frustration. Anyway, so enough bitching and complaining from me. This is a long-winded way of saying that this fight is challenging. And it may be frustrating for you, especially in 10-man. The main elements relative to normal are pretty much the same. You still have, the main movement mechanics. You want to stomp out active volcanoes while not knocking out the inactive ones if you can help it. You still got the lava flows to avoid, magma flows, the fragment spawns, and the sparks still need to be killed off in the same relative time frame. The only new addition for this part of the phase is when Rhyolith stomps out an active volcano, he'll spawn 10 liquid obsidians, which are just little slimes. They will spawn kind of randomly around him about 30 yards or so. And they move very slowly, but they don't have any threat, and they just walk straight toward him. If they reach Rhyolith, he will gain 1% of his armor back for each obsidian that he absorbs. So I think the idea of the fight is to control the obsidians and kill them off or snare them long enough that you can beat them down like you normally would. That said, we tried a number of strategies ranging from complete killing and destruction and control of obsidians all the way to ignoring them completely. And it's worth mentioning that we got our kill that you see here by pretty much ignoring them. We never actively focused on controlling them, mostly because we didn't have the classes for it in the raid. But we, even when we did, we would use AE snares from a Death Knight and knockbacks from a Druid, and that would lower the obsidian count quite a bit, but that's also wasted time and DPS that could be spent doing other things. In the end, the actual armor value on Rhyolith does not greatly hinder your DPS as the armor drops. So it's pretty much reverse exponential. As his armor goes down, the damage difference that you actually gain is very tiny. So, we did a little bit of research on it. And for example, if he has 40% armor with our raid DPS, it would take approximately 40 seconds to push him from 50% to 25. But if he has all the way down to 10% armor, it only gains us about 15 seconds of DPS time. So it's 26 or so seconds instead of 40. But to get him 30% armor lower, that's 3 extra volcanoes. So that's actually a huge time span in the fight itself. So in other words, there's this happy medium point where you don't really need to worry about the armor reduction anymore. You just want to start burning him down. So that's the basic strategy that we ended up with that finally got us our kill. We stopped focusing on having to get every single volcano until he was down to 0 and then burn him down. Instead, we found a happy medium point based on the time that had passed in the fight itself and his health level. The general rule was we wanted him to be about 50% health, hopefully below 40% armor, and then have just killed off the set of fragments that were just spawned, and hopefully just destroyed the most recent active volcano. This would allow us to not be dealing with an active volcano for a great deal of time, because it would take about 20 or 30 seconds to push the phase. And then also we wouldn't have that fragment explosion happening, since fragments will explode 30 seconds after they spawn. So that was the basic idea for our strategy. Other than that, things are much like normal for this first phase. It's just everything is amped up. We're using 2 tanks and 2 healers. We have a druid and a paladin healer, and a paladin and a warrior tank. And a lot of strategies use 1 tank, and they don't really, quote, tank the fragments. And we tried that, and it works fine. It's easy to heal. But for us, our warrior was able to do just as much, if not more, DPS as protection on the fragments than if he was DPSing. So it just offered more control in the end for us to do it this way. The downside is of 2 tanks is that you can't afford 3 healers, at least with our DPS, our current gear. So with 2 healers, it's a pretty hectic fight. There's a ton of damage, and the main key is to get active volcanoes stomped quickly. You cannot afford to let one go for more than, I would say, 15 to 20 seconds, longer than it should, or you'll just be behind from that point on. And you can't really recover. The other reason for this is because as he stomps out the inactive volcanoes, his damage increases, and so that can make it a lot harder to deal with the stomp damage when the fire debuff is applied to people. So at this point, you can see his health is getting pretty low. We've initiated a burn. We had some fragments that we had to kill off so they wouldn't explode, but then we've used Lust around the 50% mark, and everyone is just focusing on 1 foot to push him over the edge. So the idea is to defeat Rhyolith as close to the 5-minute mark as possible, or sooner if you can. The reason for this is once 5 minutes have passed, he will start gaining a stacking buff called Superheated, which increases his total damage by 10% per stack, and this increases once every 10 seconds. So after the 5-minute mark, as you can imagine, this becomes extremely difficult to continue the fight with any sort of stability. So we've entered into the last phase. Again, this is 25%, and there's one final new mechanic on this part, which is these little beams that are floating around. These just kind of go in a random pattern, and they do a small AE around them to anyone near them. So just kind of watch your positioning if you can. They're not that dangerous, but we chose to have everyone spread out. And I suppose theoretically you could stack up. You just have to be aware if a beam comes near you and move. But this is very much a burn phase. Now, obviously we used Lust earlier to push into this phase because the first part is a lot harder than this part of the fight. But this is still quite a challenge for healing and just personal cooldowns and raid survival. You just need to survive long enough to finish them off as the damage increases, especially if you're over the 5-minute mark. We have 2 superheated stacks at this point, I think. I don't know if we hit a third or not. But, you know, I'm basically running on fumes as far as mana. You know, again, we're using 2 healers, so we're using all our raid cooldowns. Anything you have to survive, because you don't have to last very long. This part of the fight does not go very much time. And as a druid healer, just saving tranquility for this part is huge and will make a big difference. So yeah, that's Lord Rhyolith Heroic. So not a very fun fight at this point, but hopefully that helps, and good luck. Thanks for watching.